Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Aman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the fullbacks ahead of the 2025 season, going through who are the best guns. Do we start with Isaiah Iongi, which is causing a lot of debate in the SuperCoach community, who's a potential cheapie, but the fullbacks are traditionally a very high scoring position, so there's plenty to get our teeth stuck into in this video. So if you do enjoy it, please do give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing as well if you enjoy the content on the channel. We're on the road to 5,000, which is just an amazing target as well. Do follow me on Instagram, where I'm posting a lot more specific player profiles these days, just because video frequency is a little bit more difficult, just being very busy at the moment. But also follow me on Twitter. Also sign up to my Patreon as well if you are interested in seeing a bit more bonus content over there as well. All the links will be in the description. But without further ado, let's get into the video. So as always, wanting to take a quick look at how fullbacks rank generally in the top 20 in averaging players. And if you've been playing SuperCoach for a few seasons now, you know that the fullbacks are generally the highest scoring position in the game. If you're new to SuperCoach, this is why you're seeing a lot of blue everywhere when I've shaded them. They're just such a high upside position. Last year, top 4 of the top 20 averaging players were all fullbacks. Then you had Kalen Ponga coming in after, Scott Drinkwater, Reece Walsh, even Keanu Kinney features in that list there. On average, you're probably getting about 4 to 6 gun fullbacks at least a year. But if like last year was almost a bit of an exception where you had 8 who were all averaging over 70, and we had 4 fullbacks averaging over 80, 5 actually averaging over 80 and 1 over 90. Like insane numbers, and that we've seen similar in seasons gone past as well. This is why there's a lot of this debate around Isaiah Iongi, who looks like he's going to be getting the number 1 jersey for Parramatta, and he's very cheap. He's 232k. So the question that people are saying is, well, it's such a high upside position, and with the flex this year, you've got the ability to be able to pick 3 of these gun fullbacks and get all the points that you may potentially want. Or do you prioritize getting the cash? It's a classic points versus cash discussion, which we do generally have at the beginning of every season, but this flex does throw a bit of a spanner into the works. So I wanted to quickly first tackle that question on Isaiah Iongi, because I feel like that's really going to frame how you even approach this video as well, because I'll be honest, after Isaiah Iongi, there's not a whole heap of potential cheapies, and a lot of the discussion is going to be on the guns. So I think just starting with him, so he's 232k, he's currently 51% ownership, so he is actually the most popular fullback in the game at the moment. What I wanted to do was just digging into numbers, of course, because I love my numbers. Just looking at what his draw looks like from rounds 1 to 12, just wanted to see if I put in some projected scores that I think he might get, what kind of price rises are we going to get from him, because I think he will be making money. Like someone playing at fullback, because it's a good position for SuperCoach, they do generally score fairly well. So let's apply some numbers behind the games that he's got upcoming. So what I've got from rounds 1 to 7. So just reading out the draw for anyone listening on audio: Melbourne, West Tigers, Bulldogs, Manly, Dragons, Canberra, and then the West Tigers again in round 7. So I think round 2 onwards, after that Melbourne game, it definitely looks a little bit better. What I've kind of done to score, I've tried to be more conservative and not going too crazy, but also not too punishing. So for example, Melbourne, I've given him 40, and I've given him 40 as the kind of the low, because he had one score of 47 last year. So kind of just taking that as a bit of a proxy. 40 for Melbourne, I'm giving him 70 versus the Tigers, 50 versus the Bulldogs, 45 against Manly, 60 versus the Dragons, 60 versus the Raiders, and then 70 again versus the West Tigers before he has a bye in round 8. So the way that I've projected this, using those numbers, and this has to be credited to NRL SuperCoach Stats.com, which is honestly the bloodline of this channel. I'll put a link in the description below. Do definitely check them out, and do donate as well if you do use them a lot, which I do, because they're just an absolute godsend for SuperCoach. So what you look at from rounds 4 to 7, when his prices will start increasing, he would go from 232k up to 412. So you're looking at just under 200k of cash gen up until round 7 before his buy in round 8, which is really, really handy. And I think that's actually being pretty fair in terms of what we can expect to earn out of him, just based on the scores that I've put there. The risk will be obviously some lower scores than the cash gen does get capped, but the upside could be if he goes and scores one big kind of 90-100, all of a sudden you are looking at a lot of cash gen. If we extend further after round 8, so looking to round 9, where he's got the Sharks, Dolphins, Sharks, Dolphins, Knights, and Manly. I was about to say Warriors, sorry. So then he goes up from that 412k, peaking to about 500k by round 12. Now, obviously, I've just capped it to round 12 because we're getting to a point then where who knows what's going to happen in the season. A lot of people might just want to cash him in round 8 as well. That's kind of why I wanted to just end it here at round 12. So let's assume before you get to Origin, if you've kept him the whole way through, he could make you about 270k in cash between round 1 to round 12. And I've put no cash gen in round 8 because he's got the buy, so his price won't change in that week. So I think the question is, like, if you put your own scoring, and you can put this into the NRL SuperCoach Stats price change tool, you know, if you're looking at, like what I'm looking at here, I'm looking at 200k potentially by round 7, very, very handy money. And maybe by that point, you've decided what gun fullback you want to get. You've made 200k, you then flick Iongi on, you find some money from elsewhere, and then you go and pick up maybe a fallen fullback gun, or maybe you find the money elsewhere and you go upgrade to a gun fullback. So I think 200k by round 7 is very hard to turn up. And especially I think if you don't have a lot of good other cash cows or cheapies in the game. My view on it at the moment, so every draft I've made so far has been with 3 gun fullbacks, mainly also because I don't want to make a team which has him, because I think it's going to look really good because you'll have so much money freed up. I think the question, you know, I look at things that, like, if you have 3 gun fullbacks, you are obviously compromising somewhere else. Having a 3rd gun fullback is probably the difference between having maybe like a really cheap halfback that's not that great, or a Nico Hines. And so I think if you find that there's, you know, Tom Duffy's potentially going to be a cheapie, who I've actually already spoken about in the halfback video, which hasn't come out yet, but I've recorded it. You know, if he's not actually there as a cheapie, then all of a sudden you're probably looking at your halfback spot thinking, oh, there's not many other great options. I might just want to go double gun. But all of a sudden at fullback, you're like, well, I've got this really good potential cheapie here in Iongi, but it's taking up that fullback slot. I personally think my gut does tell me to start with him, and that's because we've always operated on a basis where we've got the 2 gun fullbacks, and that's it. We've never had the option to have 3, and we've always been fine with having 2 gun fullbacks. Having a cheapie there who's going to make some money and potentially might score some decent points is fine. You don't have to win SuperCoach in rounds 1 to 4. Obviously, if you get a really fast start, that might be really helpful for you to be able to win it in the end, but no one's going to win SuperCoach in rounds 1 to 4. But that money that you make could eventually help set up the rest of your team elsewhere to make you win it at the end. And so I'm looking at it where even if you just go to round 8, if you can make 200k or close to 200k from Iongi, then it allows you to go double gun half. You can probably have really good options in every other position except fullback. But that might be enough of a good trade-off, especially when Iongi himself still looks like a decent player himself and still can score well. So I have a feeling that that's where I'm probably going to end up landing when we get to round 1. The only situation I think that I probably won't, and this is all kind of just gut feel at the moment, if we have a lot of other good cheapies elsewhere, like let's say you do get a Tom Duffy, you get a cheapie at halfback, let's say you do get 2 good double cheapie hookers, like maybe in a Brendan Hands and a Corey Pakes from the Broncos has been rumoured, you put Sandon Smith at halfback as your backup, then all of a sudden you're looking at a situation where your squad structure is like, well, I've got plenty of good other cheapies elsewhere. I can actually then go and afford 3 gun fullbacks and I'm still happy with the rest of the team. Then I think it's obviously completely valid that you go the 3 gun fullbacks. But I do think that if we're really struggling for good other cheapies, Iongi is probably going to be someone that a lot of people just default to because it's just going to make the rest of the team look so much better. And I think the money potential that he can make does justify his selection. So I understand the 51%. I don't currently have him, but I can see myself definitely landing there in round 1. But if you are looking at the 3 gun fullback approach, we're going to get into all of that good stuff now. So taking a look at the gun fullbacks, where the most focus of the video will be, there's not going to be much more discussion around other cheaper options. So on the list that I've got here, these are the fullbacks who averaged over 70 last year. I've got Tedesco, Tom Trbojevic, Latrell Mitchell, Dylan Edwards, Kalen Ponga, Scott Drinkwater, Reece Walsh, and Keanu Kinney. A couple of call outs here. So with Tedesco and Reece Walsh, I put some asterisks next to their names. That's because the numbers that I'm showing on the screen here are their averages, excluding injury-affected games. Because Reece Walsh had an injury-affected game versus Penrith. Teddy had one against the Bulldogs, I think it was, from last year. And those were games where they only played like literally 4 minutes. So I thought, obviously, it's not a fair representation of what they had performed last year. So let's take them out. Most of these other players were fine. Keanu Kinney, I've actually got separate slides on most of these fullback guns, so we'll get into it. So I think starting off with Tedesco, he had just a ridiculous SuperCoach season in 2024. If you look at his non-injury affected games from last year, a 98.3 average. His average versus the easy opponents was 111.3, and he had 11 tons out of 22 games. So 50% of the games last year, he was scoring over 100. And that's by far the most of any of these fullbacks on the list here. But his ownership is only 5%. Whereas you look at other names here like Turbo, Latrell, Ponga, they're all hitting close to 30 plus. Why is Teddy so much further down? Is it the draw? So if we look at the draw for Tedesco, we're looking at Broncos, Penrith, Warriors, Titans, Rabbitohs, Broncos, Penrith again, Dragons, Dolphins, bye, Bulldogs, Sharks. I think from rounds 3 to 5, there's a decent run, but South is always a local derby game. Broncos depends on what we're going to see, so it's kind of hard to call that game. Penrith twice is tough though. Like having to play Penrith twice is not the best. And if you look at Teddy's average versus hard opponents from last year, granted, small sample size, but it was 56.8. If I actually go back further in history, I say history, the last kind of 3 seasons, just to see what it looks like with Teddy against hard opponents. So if you go all the way back to 2022 to 2024, his average against hard opponents is 63.6. Against easy opponents, it's close to 90. And obviously, if you look at last year's bar graph, it was a massive outlier compared to the 2 seasons prior. I just think the reason his ownership is so low is one is the starting price. He needs to be punching out like a mid-90s average just to be holding value. And I think when you don't have really obvious games, maybe apart from round 4, Titans at home, where you think, I'm going to absolutely captain him, then the money does start becoming really hard to justify, especially if you don't think you're going to captain the bloke. And it's not like we don't have other good fullback options as well. And with the Roosters, they're going through a lot of change as well. You know, apart from last year, Teddy was on a... If you looked at his averages from 2021 till 2023, he was on a decline. Last year, though, he just came and completely reversed everything and said, I'm back, boys. But I think with Teddy, the draw, Roosters, a lot of change. The value probably not quite being there at the start of the season. Look, I can understand it. You're not going to go wrong, I guess, with Teddy. You may just lose some cash. That's probably the biggest risk here. But there may be a situation where round 4 onwards, if he's dropped a bit of cash, you might want to potentially go and pick him up at that point. I can see that maybe being a strategy. But given that there is an obvious dip in his scores against tough opponents, which I will say, that happens for all the fullbacks. Tough draw to start off with, I think, with this, and more so the Roosters just going through some change. There's enough ifs there that I think paying over 900k when you don't feel like it's a slam dunk, that's probably why Teddy's ownership is so low at 5%. Now, I'll make it very clear and obvious who my favorite fullback is to start with, and that's Tom Trbojevic. He's 875k. He had an average last year of 89.4 when, a lot of people thought he probably had a good season, but it wasn't like anything amazing. We've seen Tommy go absolutely ballistic in the past. Cough, cough, 2021. 95.4 average against the easy opponents last year, and that was 68.8 against the tough opponents. So look, there's obviously a dip against tough opponents, but the difference with Manly versus the Roosters is that if you look at the first kind of 6-7 games, there's not many tough opponents. You've got Melbourne and Sharks in their rounds 5-6, but at least Melbourne's at home. Cowboys, Warriors, Canberra, and Para, 3 of those being at home, is what's so juicy for Turbo, and that's why he's 31% owned. He is the highest owned gun fullback that we've got on the list here. Just going to the deep dive slide on Turbo. So we've spoken already about how many good home games he's got. At 4 Pines Park, if you look back in the last 3 seasons, his average against all opposition is 91.3. If you then factor in the easy opponents he's played at 4 Pines Park, 101.5 becomes his average. So this is the difference between him and, say, like a Teddy. Opening draw looks fantastic. He's got such a clear, obvious advantage in his scoring at 4 Pines Park. You're thinking automatically, this is a guy I can captain round 1, I can captain him round 3, I can captain him round 4. Therefore, paying that 875k price tag looks a lot more justifiable. If you also look at previous years against just easy opponents in general, so excluding having to play at 4 Pines Park, the average is 95.4 last year and it was 105.7. 2022 was his injury impacted season, so the numbers, in general are quite low, but I wouldn't read so much into them. The last couple of seasons, he's been generally a bit more fit and available. So we're looking at 95 and 105 as his averages against easy opponents in the last 2 seasons. There's enough there for me to say, yep, Turbo, I think I'm just going to be starting with him. The ownership is starting to creep up there as well. Probably doesn't help that I'm spruiking him nonstop on social media as well. Look, from round 6 onwards, it does get tougher. You can even count round 5 in that. But it's still, look, it's Melbourne Sharks, not great. But then it's Dragons at home around 7. Again, you have to think, do I really not want to have him in this period? Round 8, maybe there's an argument that you sell him because you're saying it's Penrith away, then a bye, then it's the Sharks, then it's Cowboys and Parramatta again, but they're away, and then he goes into Origin. I can definitely see that from maybe round 8 being viable, but I think 1 to 7, I really don't see many reasons that you don't start with him, considering the draw, the home games, and how well he does perform at 4 Pines Park. So he is definitely my kind of consensus number 1 pick, I think, at fullback. And I think if you're going 2 guns or 3 guns, I think he's got to be the one that you do put in number 1 and you figure out the other spot. Very boring take because I think a lot of people are saying that, but it's all for, in what we think, good reasons. Moving on to the third player, which is Latrell Mitchell, 866k and 88.5 average last year, which was his best in SuperCoach. 96.6 average against easy opponents last year. That did drop to 52.5 though, against the hard opposition. One thing to note though with that 52.5, that does include a game of 36 that he scored against the Roosters last year, but it was the game where he got a sin bin and yours truly did trade him in for that week. So thanks Latrell. But if you exclude that game, the only other game he played against tough opponent last year was the Bulldogs, and he scored 69 points. If you actually look at Latrell historically, how he performs against a tough opposition, the one good thing with Latrell, he is probably the most fixture proof of these gun fullbacks. Look, he's got the goal kicking, which the other 2 guys we have spoken about already don't have. So that already helps him with his scoring. His scoring average is generally going to be a little bit higher than some of these other guys because he's got the goal kicking. There's just a lot of qualitative factors, if you want to call it that make Latrell look more appealing for this year as well. Wayne Bennett is back. That's huge. If you see the preseason footage of him, he's looking lean, he's looking happy. It's just and we know Latrell is a guy who plays big on form. He's a bit streaky at times, but when he's on it, there's no other player almost as destructive or as good as him. If you're looking back at his averages against easy opponents, 96, 80, and 111 in the last 3 seasons. The hard opponents, 52.5, which we've already kind of clarified, included that one poor game. Then it's 74 and 70 in 23 and 22. Surprisingly, also, he doesn't actually have that big of a difference playing home or away. Home games, 82.6 in the last 3 years, 85.7 in that same period. And I think the reason I wanted to mention all of that is because the draw on paper for Latrell doesn't look great. The first 2 Dolphins and Dragons are fine, both away, but as you can see right next to my head, 85.7 average, you'll take that for sure. Same with the Sharks away. Penrith, Roosters, Cowboys all at home. Bulldogs and Melbourne. It is a tough run there, especially between rounds 3 to 8. But as the numbers do show, he is the most fixture proof. He's got 70 averages even against tough opponents. I think if you just add, this is one more where you have to go a bit more on eye test and your gut feel and just knowing the caliber of the player. With Wayne Bennett back looking good in the preseason, it does all seem to point towards Latrell just being he would be my number 2 pick, I think, behind Tommy Turbo. Just because of, draw aside, I know the draw is tough, but I'm trying to pay less attention to the draw, especially at the beginning, just because I think it sometimes is my undoing. And the numbers do show playing away from home, still fine, tough opponents. Yes, there's a dip, but it's not dramatic. And he does still have some decent games there, rounds 1, 2, round 6, and then rounds 9 to 11, looking pretty good there for Latrell. So he's looking really good, and I do think I will be, if I can, I'll try to squeeze him into my 2 fullback spots. I haven't had him in a preseason draft to this point, but that was more squad structure and trying to make things work with other players. And so the 866k did become a little bit more difficult to fit in. It was kind of him or Ponga that I've been flip-flopping between. But Latrell, I think with those numbers and how he performs against tough opponents, I think he's, definitely not a must, but very hard to resist. I think the guy that I've been really comping him the most to for position 2 and 3 is Kalen Ponga. So I'll quickly mention Kalen Ponga just now. So he's 790k, had an 80.1 average last year. It was an 89 average against easy opponents, and it was 63 against the tough opponents. And he's 30% owned, so he's actually a little bit above Latrell. Now, similar with Latrell, he's got the goal kicking. Now, probably doesn't rely on scoring as much as, say, Latrell does, because base is a touch better. But Ponga still is someone who we like to target during good runs of fixtures because he's got that goal kicking and he's got really genuine upside against easy opposition. So taking a look at his last 2 seasons, I excluded 2022 for Ponga just because it was very injury impacted and kind of created a little bit of noise and stuff when doing these averages. So I thought, let's look at the last 2 years where he's been consistently a bit more fit and healthy, playing at fullback as well and goal kicking. So his average against easy opponents we mentioned was 89 last year. Year before was 105. So if you take that all, it was 96 against easy opponents, and it was 75 against tough opponents as well. A lot of that is due to how he performed in 2023 when he was just on like almost a completely different level. It did definitely fall back though last year to 63.4. The reason that Ponga looks very appealing though for this preseason is the draw to start off with. He does have an early bye in round 4, but we're looking at Tigers, Dolphins, Titans. After the bye, he's got Bulldogs, Tigers again, then the Sharks, but then Warriors, Rabbitohs, Titans, Parramatta, and then Penrith in round 12. Really for me, I'm just more looking at if you can avoid playing Melbourne or Penrith, I think the draw looks okay. And he doesn't play Penrith until round 12. So draw looks unreal. Yes, that bye in round 4 is a little bit annoying, but now that you do have that flex position, you can probably cover for him a little bit better. And I think while the Knights do have their own issues where, they don't have a settled halves combination and things like that, I think we've seen that with Ponga just last 2 years. He just puts the team on his back and he still seems to score okay, even despite having those issues in the halves for the Knights. And even irrespective of their form, he does just tend to go pretty well in any case. Last year he started a little bit slow. He had scores of I think 45 and 50, but then he really exploded. And I think with these with these good games to start off with, even a team like the Bulldogs, I know they were impressive defensively last year, but maybe it takes them a little bit of time to get into the swing of things as well. You might look at that and say, maybe that matchup's not as bad as it looks on paper. For me, I'm really appealed by the draw. And even though the Troll would be my preference above Ponga, what you find though is that there's a 76k difference in price between the two. And that 76k can really go quite far in terms of bolstering your team. If I think of a second row forward, for example, if you've got Isaiah Papali'i at 585, but if you're getting cold feet on him, if you went Latrell down to Ponga, Isaiah Papali'i can become Haumole Olakau'atu, for example. And then you start to think, okay, IPAP and Latrell or Olakau'atu and Ponga. My brain is probably thinking the Olakau'atu-Ponga combination sounds better actually. So this is where Ponga becomes really appealing. Good draw. Probably doesn't have quite the same... he definitely has a ceiling. Probably doesn't look as scary as maybe Latrell does. But, this time last year, all of us were saying Ponga is an absolute essential. He's a must-have. He's sub 800k, so that looks really appealing. Like, he actually looks like he's at a pretty good price as well. So that's why at the moment I've had Ponga and Turbo as my main combo, mainly because of price. If I can fit Latrell in, then I'll take Latrell. But if I can't, Ponga is probably going to be my default that I go to. And if I go 3-gun fullbacks, as much as I possibly can, I'll probably be trying to go Ponga, Latrell, and Turbo. Obviously, that's a lot of money, but this is the best position to be targeting. So, long story short, really, really like Kalyn Ponga. I think people are not underestimating him because he's very highly owned at 30%. But for me, just again, looking at gut feel, draw looks nice. I really like that price tag. Just looking at sub 800k, it just feels nice knowing that you're getting someone who's got that potential to go 85, 90, 100 plus averaging for sub 800k. It feels good. It's like a warm, cozy blanket. So Ponga for me, I think very close to being settled into my round 1 team as well. Just wanted to quickly touch on Dylan Edwards, who I did skip over. 839k. Great season for him last year with an 85.7 average and pretty consistent. And a lot of that is just due to his base stats. If you look at the graphs below me, you can see that Dylan Edwards and Keanu Kinney are really bossing it when it comes to base stats. So he had an 85 average against easy opponents and 86 against hard opponents. So it didn't really matter so much with Dylan Edwards, who he was coming up against. The biggest thing with him this year, that why he's got such low ownership at 6%, is if you remember from last year, so many of his big scores when he was scoring over 100 plus came when Cleary wasn't in the side, and then he took up the goal kicking duties. So he had a scoring average last year of 17. If you go back though to 2023 and 2022, those scoring averages go down dramatically to 9 and 7. This is where I think people have the concern, because you're looking at someone who may potentially lose 7 to 8 points of just value immediately because he's going to lose a goal kicking when Cleary's in that team. Now, granted, if Cleary does get injured, misses games for an extended period, Dylan Edwards with the goal kicking will become a genuine option. But from round 1, if we think that Cleary is going to be available, Edwards probably just doesn't quite really feel like a value prospect at 839k, knowing that his average was boosted by those games without Cleary. Just looking back to last year, the games with Cleary, he had an average of 78, without 90. So if you're looking at 78 maybe being what you expect him to perform at, look, that's still a great average, but it's not value. That's the thing. And you would be losing money on him as well. It's not like the draw is unbelievable on paper as well. I know Penrith obviously a gun team, but they are losing a lot of key players like Fisher, Harris and Luai. Maybe it takes some time for them to get into the rhythm of things as well. There's enough things for me to say Dylan Edwards, look, great real life player, but probably not going to be it for me from a Supercoach point of view. Now, the next three guys, Drinkwater, Reece Walsh and Keanu Kenney, really interesting because they're all kind of coming in that mid 700s to lower 700 price range. So this is when it becomes interesting, when it's like, okay, if I had to sacrifice one of maybe Latrell or maybe a Ponga, can I default to one of these other guys? Can they match them, but I get them at a cheaper price? Looking purely at the numbers on their averages versus easy opponents, Reece Walsh is the one who probably sticks out a little bit, because if you look at that list there in terms of averages against easy opponents, Ponga was at 89. I mean, Latrell and Turbo head and shoulders at 95, 96, and Teddy was just out of this world. But Reece Walsh was 88 last year. What I will say with Reece Walsh is his numbers do exclude that injury impacted game versus Penrith. But an 88 average versus easy opponents and then 66 versus the hard opponents, this is what you expect from Reece Walsh. He does feast on the weaker teams, but when the better teams come up against him, he's not going to be performing as well. So quickly just touching a little bit more on Reece Walsh in general. So I've only looked at his last two seasons when he's been back at the Broncos. Been very good at around a low 80s average, about an 80 average in both seasons, and pretty consistent as well against easy versus hard teams. 88 and 87 versus easy opponents, and 66 and 68 versus hard. So I think there's a very clear identifiable trend of you want to choose him when he's got easy games and avoid him when he's got tough games. And that's generally pretty standard for most of these fullbacks, barring maybe the likes of a Turbo or Latrell, who are just seemingly just absolute weapons. One thing I like about Reece Walsh is the draw. Rounds 2 to round 5 look pretty good. You avoid the Roosters in round 1 and 6. But also Roosters, look, they're changing. They've got a lot of new people coming in. They might not be as tough of a team as we have seen in last year. So if you look at the Roosters maybe not being that bad, then it's really not until round 9 when it's Penrith, when you're thinking, oh, that's not too great. But then he follows that up with Rabbitohs and the Dragons. So not terrible. So overall, the draw up until round 12 before the first bye is not bad. He doesn't have that early bye like how Ponga does. So that's one thing it is in Reece Walsh's favour. You won't have the goal kicking though, because Adam Reynolds will be taking that duty. But if Adam Reynolds is ever out, then Reece Walsh goal kicking is obviously going to become a massive watch when it comes to Supercoach. He was in my very first round 1 team, and that was more because I thought new coach, revitalized Broncos outfit, who are a good team. They made it to the grand final early in 2023. I thought at 738k, it's not a bad price for someone who can get around that early 80s average. And when he comes up against easy opponents, that does bump up to 87. So I was looking at it as, maybe there's actually some value there, getting some cash rises out of him, but also getting some good points. So I don't hate Reece Walsh. I probably have him slightly above Scott Drinkwater. I think the draw is a bit better than it is with Scott Drinkwater. Some preseason news coming out that, some of the Broncos players don't love Madge Maguire's approach because he's very much a disciplinarian. So I think for me, I'm not super hot on him, but nor am I absolutely cold on him, not interested. Definitely a watch for me, and I want to hear more about what happens with this preseason stuff and with Madge Maguire. If I wanted to go 3-gun fullbacks, but I couldn't make it fit where I had Latrell in there, and I had to go a little bit cheaper, but still wanted guns, my 3 combo probably would be Turbo, Ponga, and Reece Walsh. That's what I had in my round 1. That's what I had in my initial team reveal. And I just like that. I think the Broncos could be in for an upswing. And I like that draw on paper. I think it's pretty good. A few games there in Queensland, which I do like as well, against the Cowboys. Dolphins is in Queensland. Then it's the Tigers in Queensland as well. And I think playing in Queensland in general is probably going to be better for him when it comes to better tracks and better surfaces to be playing on as well. So yeah, definitely interested in Reece Walsh. If he has goal kicking, then it's an absolute almost no-brainer. But for me, it's more price. 738k feels like a good price for someone who we know has got the potential to be a mid-80s averaging player when he's coming up against favourable opponents. Just quickly taking a look at Scott Drinkwater, he actually has similar parallels to Reece Walsh in terms of averages against easy and tough opponents. So in the last 3 seasons, we're looking at 85.6 versus 63.7 against hard opponents. So pretty clear split there with him as well. Draw-wise, probably not as favourable as Reece Walsh's, and that's why I'd slightly lean Reece Walsh. I would look at it and say, I'll take that 32k price saving and take the guy who doesn't have any buys until round 12 and what I think is a better draw. When it comes to Drinkwater, we're looking at a Cowboys team who have lost a fair few key players, a lot of turnover in that squad. Now, I will caveat this. I say I take Reece Walsh over Drinkwater. If we find out that Drinkwater's goal kicking though, then it becomes a bit of a more difficult discussion to just say, oh, I'll take Reece Walsh over Drinkwater, because we know that goal kicking is such a massive boost for scoring when it comes to Supercoach. I think Val Holmes averaged maybe about 10 to 12 points a game from goal kicking. Now, let's maybe discount that a little bit. Let's just say the Cowboys don't score as many points as they did last year. Let's say he gets an extra 8 points. Then all of a sudden, we're looking at an average of 78.7, up 8 points to, what are we doing, 86.7. Then automatically there is value, and that puts him in the territory more of your Kalen Pongers and your Latrells. Then Drinkwater becomes almost a bit of a no-brainer actually as well. I know I've said no-brainer about a lot of these fullbacks, but this is why three-gun fullbacks looks appealing. There's so many good options. Draws a little tough with Manly, Sharks, Broncos, Canberra, Penrith, and the Rabbitohs before the bye in round 7. Probably doesn't fully even open up then either, because you do have Penrith again in round 10. There's no probably real consistent run of good fixtures that you'd say on offer there for Drinkwater. Home versus away, he doesn't really have that much of a bias towards playing at home, apart from in 2023. Last year was pretty consistent between the two. It was more when he was versing easy versus tough opponents. I think there's enough tough opponents in there that I look at, like the Sharks, Penrith. Manly away is not easy. Rabbitohs away could also be quite difficult before the bye in round 7. Look, with goal kicking, he could be hard to pass up, but I might maybe just take a flyer on Reece Walsh to start off with and maybe hope that I can trade up to Drinkwater if I have to. I think Drinkwater will be really good through the origin period though if he doesn't get selected, because a lot of these other guns like Turbo, Latrell, Reece Walsh, they'll all be in contention for origin. If Drinkwater's not, then all of a sudden he does become that option during that period. So round 1, I'm kind of him and Reece Walsh, I'm really 50-50 on one of the two. I think I'm slightly leaning Reece Walsh just because of the draw, but if the goal kicking is there for Drinkwater, it will be very tough to pass up. The final guy in the gun category I wanted to touch on is Keanu Kinney, and I think there's quite a bit of interest in him just from what I've seen online on like say Instagram and stuff. People were asking for deep dives on Keanu Kinney, so there is one here, don't you worry. So we may as well just jump over to that. Let's do that. Right, yeah, Keanu Kinney. So the first thing to call out with Keanu Kinney is that he's just an absolute beast when it came to work rate. So his average base power was 48 last year. That actually does include his round 19 game versus Parramatta where he only played 27 minutes. I'm sure if you exclude that game, his base power is probably north of 50. Because if you look at that bar chart, we're looking at base of 35. Only Dylan Edwards had better. And then evasive numbers of 24. So he's probably one of those guys who's got the best floor on him, where if he doesn't get any attacking stats, he's probably going to be close to getting about a 50 average. Then if you do add the attacking stats, then obviously he's going to be pushing up into that 70s average. So last year, if you exclude that one game where he only played the 27 minutes, his average did increase from 72 to 75.7. Home versus away, he actually fared better away, 80.7 versus 71.3. Again, he also has a pretty good split when he plays easy opponents versus tough opponents, 81.5 versus 59.5 when he plays the hard opponents. One thing with the Titans that I do like is their draw. Round 1 is a bit frustrating because you do have that bye. Bulldogs also away, maybe is not the best. Then it's the Knights, Roosters, Dolphins, Dragons, Canberra, Cowboys, Bulldogs again, and then Knights again and Canberra. So no Melbourne, no Penrith, no Sharks in the opening 12 weeks. That looks really, really tempting. It's only the Bulldogs and Roosters games in there that probably are a little bit tougher. I think with him, what's probably going to make me not start with him, firstly, is just that buy in round 1. Ideally, I'd like to avoid that if I can. And then it's Bulldogs in round 2. Then it's the Roosters in round 4. I know they might not be as tough as last year, but still, they're not easy games on paper. I think round 5 might be when you do potentially want to target him because, look, he's Kiwi, so he's not going to be available during Origin. And the other thing I'd probably just want to see is that, yes, while he's probably predicted to play at number 1 to start off with for the Titans, you just know that there is Jaden Campbell, there is AJ Brimson. If they don't start well, maybe they change things up and maybe Kinney's not in that jersey anymore. I would think that he stays there based on how well he performed there last year, but there is always that risk. It's probably just enough for me when I'm like, I can just take Reece Walsh, who there's no job security concerns over. He will be their fullback. There's Ponga, there's Turbo, there's Latrell, There's Drinkwater. All these guys have got absolute nailed roles. Kinney, I'd say, just not quite there, even though I think that he's more likely going to be that number one fullback. Not a great draw from up until round 4. After that, though, it does really open up. I can see the appeal. He's got a good work rate. He's an exciting young talent as well. If you're going for a pod, he's probably the one that I'd be going for. If I quickly just flick back to the main summary table. So we're looking at ownership of 1%. By far the least owned of any of these gun fullbacks. So I think if that's the way that you like playing the game, you want to go with a lower owned guy who does have actually a pretty decent draw, good base work rate. There's actually a lot of pros about him. So I can see the appeal for sure in starting with Kinney. He probably just doesn't quite have maybe that. I mean, he's got a big upside. He scored 150 on an occasion last year. So it's probably not fair for me to say that. But he's probably just not quite in that caliber of your Turbos, Latrells, maybe even your Pongas on his day as well. So I think if you're going 3-gun fullbacks, but money becomes tight, I can see the appeal going Kinney. I'd probably maybe lean towards Reece Walsh though in that instant, just because Reece Walsh also has shown against the easy opponents he can go 88, which rivals those other guns who I mentioned. Kinney so far is 82, which is still awesome, but that is still 5 to 10 points less than a lot of these other guys. So looks really good on paper. I'm sure that we will be looking at him very closely at some points during the season. Round 1 though, for me anyway, probably not going to be when I'll be looking at picking him. Just wrapping up the video, taking a look at some few other fullback players that I know people have been looking at. I've got Charles Klukstad, Hamiso Tabai Fido, Pappenhausen, Connor Tracy, and KO Weeks. So starting off with Nickel Klukstad, I've got an asterisk next to his name just because I've excluded one game where he did play lower minutes. His average did get to 69.7, but low ceiling, only 6% of games last year, which I think was only one game, did he actually score over 100. And I think the good work rate, like the base stats of 37 is even better than say a Dylan Edwards. So if you want to go for that safe option, maybe. But being very honest, like apart from maybe say Pappenhausen on this list here, fullback is not a spot where I think I want to be just kind of going for mid-ranges. I'd categorize these guys as mid-ranges for the purpose of fullback. I think fullback is that high upside of a position. It's not really, apart from Iongi, where you want to be chasing value. I think as far as I look at it with Nickel Klukstad, you're paying for what you get. 62k, you probably are going to get that kind of early to mid 60s average. It did increase with non-injury affected games last year to 69.7. But again, the Warriors' new halves combination, how's he going to work up? How's he going to work with them? He's got a buy in round 5 as well. Tigers in round 4 is good, but the other games aren't looking like amazing. Maybe he's someone you can target from round 7 or maybe just during the origin period. But again, for me, just probably doesn't quite have that ceiling that has me interested at fullback. Hamiso actually does have a ceiling. 20% of his games last year, he did score over 100. Non-injury impacted games, he had a 71 average, which again, really good, especially at his price at 653k. I wish he was center wing fullback though. He's lost his center wing status, so he's only available at fullback because the Dolphins actually do have a pretty decent draw for the first 1 to 5 weeks, and that's when he actually killed it last year as well. He could have actually been a sneaky pickup if we were looking at him in centers, but I think just being available at fullback, no Wayne Bennett anymore, so new coach, enough ifs there where I'm like, look, he could be good, but I think I'm happy to pay 60k more and get like a Keanu Kinney even maybe, or I'll pay a little bit extra than that and get Reece Walsh instead. Now, Pappenhausen is very interesting. He's actually quite highly owned at about 10% at this moment in time. 617k with a 66 average, and that's in non-injury impacted games from last year. Now, we know Pappy is an absolute gun of years gone past, but that was when he was goal kicking and before he had a lot of these injury issues. Now, a fit and firing Pappy, I would probably say, is someone who is closer to averaging in the 70s. And so you probably are getting some value at 616k. But I think when he's not got the goal kicking, and I don't expect him to get that back, Nick Meaney looks like he's just got the goal kicking boots for the Storm there. I think he's got that early buy in round 2 as well, then Penrith in round 3. For me, Pappy, I would love nothing more than Pappy to become a SuperCoach gun option again, like he has in seasons gone past. I absolutely love the guy. But for me, there's enough early, things there, like with that buy in Penrith, that I think I would be happy to avoid him for the start. And because of his price, look, if you do have like a Reece Walsh and it's not working out round 4, Melbourne's run does really start to open up. You're liking the look of it. You can always just trade down to Pappy. That's kind of my general approach with him, I think. Now, if you want to start with him, that's fine. But I think that early buy is a little bit annoying in there. I know Pong's got the early buy, but Pong has probably got better games that can offset that buy. With Pappy, apart from Parramatta and then maybe the Dragons from round 4, doesn't look as appealing maybe on paper. It's a good long-term draw, I'd say, for the Storm, which is why maybe I'm looking at him as a wait and watch, but probably not one for me. If we see him goal kicking in the preseason, which I don't expect, but if it happens, then I'll pick him, because we know that Pappy goal kicking is more likely going to be someone who goes from a 66 average to maybe 75. 10 points of value, then you're happy to pay that low 600s. But if you don't see that, then for me, unfortunately, don't think he'll be an option. A couple of people are looking at Connor Tracy and KO Weeks as well. Look, personally, not for me. They both are eligible in other positions. You can pick Connor Tracy at center, and you can pick KO Weeks at 5'8". I would 100% be picking them in those positions if you are interested in them. So Connor Tracy had a 62.1 average last year when he was playing at fullback. So I've taken out those other games where he wasn't playing there. Maybe if he was playing on the wing. I've just kept it to his fullback games. And look, a 62 average is fine at his price, but it's not like it's amazing, unbeatable value, absolute must. You have to pick him. I think he's a fine option, steady, but probably not one I'd be looking at who has like a massive ceiling. He had one game last year where he scored over 160. But if you look at his scores at the back end of last year, there was a lot of kind of very average scores, and I think you'd get very frustrated if you saw that. Like, he scored 167 in round 21, and then after that he went 61, 49, 89, 32, 39, 32. So there was an 89 game in there, but there was also like 3 scores in the 30s, 1 score in the 40s. Even if you look before that 167, he went 34. He feels like someone who's going to be inconsistent. I think that's going to be very frustrating. Even at center at 587k, I think there's plenty of other good picks that you can pick up ahead of Connor Tracy. With KO Weeks, he had a 54.2 average for the season. Funnily enough, his average was actually worse playing at fullback. His average was 48.7, but his average was better playing at 7 when it was 63.6. The issue is probably going to be, though, that Jamal Fogarty will be there at number 7 for the Raiders. And so I think KO Weeks, yes, he might get the fullback jersey, but his average didn't actually look that amazing there. If you look at his scores at fullback last year, 53, 42, 41, 56, 89, 30, 34. It's just very kind of underwhelming in my opinion. And I think his scores are actually better when you include those games playing at 7. When you're just getting him playing at fullback, look, maybe at 5'8", you might want to stick him there. But I think now you've got the likes of a Luke Metcalf as a better pick for cheaper. You've got Jerome Luai is not that much more expensive. You've got maybe even an Adam Dewey. I know this isn't a 5'8" video, but even KO Weeks at 5'8", I probably wouldn't love him. Therefore, I definitely don't love him as a pick at fullback, just to be brutally honest. Alright guys, that is my fullback position analysis for the 2025 preseason. Hope you all enjoyed that video and the more detailed stats that I've showed in this one. Took a lot of effort to put together, so do smash that like button if you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing as well if you want to see more content and stats like that during the preseason. Head over to my Patreon as well, where you can see those kind of stats more often, and check me out on all my other socials. But until then, see you all in the next video.